Peter Molyneux, visionary, designer, boundary breaker. A developer who promised players entire worlds and sometimes only delivered a glimpse. In this video, I want to take a look at a long, winding career of one of gaming's most fascinating figures, from his humble beginnings to the creative heights of Lionhead Studios, and finally to the quieter, more controversial days at 22 Cans. Peter Molyneux has been praised as a pioneer, mocked as a dreamer, and criticised as a serial overpromiser. But love him or loathe him, his impact on gaming, and on players like myself, is undeniable. This is the story of Peter Molyneux, the games, the promises, the legacy. Peter Molyneux got his start in the early tech industry by distributing and selling floppy disks in 1982. These floppy disks would include small video games as a little bonus to improve his sales. However, he later concluded that the main selling point was actually the games. Like, really? Took you that long to realise? From that revelation, he decided to create his very first game, The Entrepreneur, a text-based business simulation game about running a company. Released in 1984, he published the game himself by duplicating the game onto tapes using two Tandy tape recorders. He then took out an advert in a game magazine and prepared for a flood of orders, later stating in an interview that he was convinced the game would sell incredibly well, and in preparation for the flood of orders, he actually cut the letterbox in his front door bigger to fit all the extra envelopes. Following its release, the time for the orders to be filled came, and Peter sold a whopping 2 copies, one of which he speculated was actually from his mother. Now, unfortunately, due to the incredibly low sales, The Entrepreneur has been lost to time. There are no known copies or files available anywhere, so we'll never truly know what the game was like, but we do know that this at least got Peter on the step towards becoming a video game developer. However, due to the game's failure, Molyneux did take a step back from game design to start a different company, Taurus Impex Limited, a company that had an incredibly British purpose. He exported baked beans to the Middle East. Now, even with this misstep with The Entrepreneur, Molyneux was at least dedicated to try and make it as one. And with Taurus Impex, he entered a partnership with Les Edgar, who he met in a hi-fi audio shop called PJ Hi-Fi, and he will become much more important in just a bit. However, while operating Taurus Impex, Molyneux was almost given a direct sign to get back into software and game design. Molyneux received a surprising call from Commodore. They believed his company was Taurus, T-O-R-U-S. A different firm, known for creating networking software. Mistaking him for someone else, Commodore offered him 10 free Amiga systems to help import this imaginary software. Peter instantly realized the mix-up, but rather than correct them, he accepted the offer and got out of the office before they could reconsider. Using these free Amigas, Taurus designed a database system for Amiga called Acquisition. Once they had made it, they went back to Commodore and basically said, yeah, sorry, we weren't that Taurus, but look what we made. And after clearing that up with them, they released the software to a decent success. Now, with this newfound wealth, Molyneux and Edgar could open a new company, Bullfrog Productions. Following their accidental success, Molyneux and Edgar would open a new studio in 1987, Bullfrog Productions. Bullfrog's first project was to port the game Druid 2 Enlightenment from the Commodore 64 to the Amiga. And just how did Molyneux secure this project for his fledgling company? Well, by lying, of course. He stated later in an interview that he contacted the developers of Druid 2, Firebird, and he said that he could program and port games, to which I am quoting Peter here. Of course, I was bullshitting. But they believed him and gave him Druid 2 to port to Amiga systems. There clearly wasn't any due process in the 80s, was there? If I got a call today from someone saying, oh yeah, I can port your game to this system, I've totally coded loads of stuff, I'm not going to give them any of my time. Molyneux clearly had some capacity for fumbling his way upwards towards success. Now, even Edgar said that they didn't even know how to get an object across the screen. But anyway, this port of Druid 2, while it didn't really make Bullfrog a lot of money, about £4,000, which in today's money is about £15,000. It did at least give them the opportunity to figure out development, such as making and moving sprites on screen, which allowed them to develop their own routines for animation. In charge of the port for the Amiga was their new hire, Glenn Corpse. because at the time, Molyneux was busy wrapping up things with acquisition, so Corpse and Edgar worked on this particular project. When talking about Druid 2, Corpse remembered, "I basically copied the graphics and maps from the C64 version and its editor. I also did a little design work on the collision system. Even though I'd been hired as an artist, I was the only person with experience of that stuff in the company." So once again, the entire company was essentially fumbling their way towards success. After the port was completed, Bullfrog worked on their own game, a top-down shooter called Fusion, released for the Amiga. And the game, while the first originally produced project from Bullfrog, it was met with just average reviews. Essentially, it boiled down to a run-of-the-mill shoot 'em up, which had a sufficient variation of the genre. And I mean, when you look at this game, man, the 80s. You really didn't have to explain much back then, did you? Yeah, you're an orb, you float around, shoot other orbs, and sometimes you get in a spaceship and you shoot the other stuff. Any questions? I suppose that goes for almost anything released back then. Yeah, you're this green dude, walk into this cave, pick up a sword, stab stuff. Done? Even with the release of the Druid port and Fusion, those releases barely brought in enough money to cover the wages. And Corpse even said, you didn't have to be a genius to work that out. So in that vein, Corpse brought in his own Atari ST and began porting Fusion to it. But in doing so, he got distracted by another idea. I was fascinated by the isometric 3D graphics that had been huge on 8-bit machines a few years earlier. My favourite of these was Paul Shirley's Spin Dizzy. Spin Dizzy was a game released for the Commodore 64 in 1986, where you essentially controlled a probe called Gerald, and you navigate across different stages to fully explore and map out the world before the time runs out. Using this game as an inspiration, Corpse began creating similar blocks to make up an isometric landscape, and after 18 hours he had a working demonstration, a matrix of squares but seen from the side, much like Spin Dizzy. But each point could have varying heights, and create an image that sort of looked like hills and valleys. He showed the demo to the team at Bullfrog and they were captivated. Most of all, Molyneux loved it. And Corpse sent him the code so he could work on it for days on end. Corpse described essentially how Peter disappeared into his office for several days, and when he emerged, he had managed to add houses and little people to the landscape. What Molyneux had just created was the basis for his next game, Populous. At the very start of development, Populous was in some ways very simple. The humans that inhabited the land would simply wander around until they hit a barrier, like water or a hillside. So to help them move around, Molyneux added the ability for the player to raise and lower the land. Then, in order to reduce the amount of people on screen to save memory, Molyneux added the ability for humans to build houses on flat land. And if the player grew the flat land around it, the house would get bigger. Slowly, the idea of the player's godlike intervention shaping the landscape and guiding these people would form the foundation of the game. Weeks of playtesting at Bullfrog ensued, and more features were added. The concept of an opposing continent, spells like natural disasters formed, which to limit their powerful ability, Molyneux created the mana requirement, which the player earned from creating settlements. Now the game had a purpose for creating these towns and destroying your rivals. While they didn't realise it at the time, Bullfrog had begun creating a brand new genre in the gaming landscape, the God game. And while nobody knew it at that time, often just calling it a two-player strategy game, the basis for it was there. No single character to control, power over the elements of the landscape, guiding the AI, it was all ready. The very first prototype for this game was created using Lego, and while Molyneux admitted it didn't help with balancing the game, it did offer a useful angle for the media and publicity. Bullfrog would demo the game to dozens of publishers, eventually securing Electronic Arts, who had a gap in their release schedule and took a chance on the game. And in 1989, Populous was released. Upon its release, Populous was met with critical acclaim. 5 stars in the Roll of Computers magazine, Computer Gaming World praising its simplicity and design. It won awards for the best strategy game the following year. And all the while, the concept of a God game to Molyneux was difficult to publish. He never imagined Populous would be as successful as it was, but overall it would sell at least 4 million copies. Eventually, Les Edgar would also license out the game to be ported to systems like the Super Nintendo and Mega Drive. And to capitalise on its success, EA would push for more releases in the following year, bringing Powermonger to market in 1990, Populous 2 in 1991, and soon Bullfrog was praised as a developer known for innovation and pioneering software. In 1994, following a huge expansion to the team, 3 games were in development at Bullfrog: Creation, Theme Park, and Magic Carpet. Of those 3, Theme Park would prove to be immensely popular, winning Game of the Year, bestseller in Europe. Bullfrog were on a warpath and making banger after banger. And while all this was going on, Les Edgar was in the background working on merging Bullfrog with larger entities. Bullfrog already had numerous offers to buy the company, but they weren't taken seriously until companies like EA and Philips reached out. And in 1995, Bullfrog was acquired by EA for $44 million. And Molyneux, he was catapulted to Vice President of EA and head of the European branch. Edgar became Vice President of the European branch and Chairman of Bullfrog. It was a massive change, and Molyneux promised that Bullfrog's quality wouldn't suffer as a result of the buyout. But the number of games in development meant that there was less time to refine each one. EA would keep dialing up the pressure, and games would have to be shipped out much sooner than they were ready. Molyneux's new corporate position meant he could spend less time assisting the development team and more time traveling, meeting with the heads of EA. And in July 1996, Molyneux made it known to EA that he was becoming frustrated with this new role, and he wanted to stick to development, even alluding to the fact that he wanted to leave. And as a result of that conversation, EA basically banned him from entering the Bullfrog offices and relocated the entire Dungeon Keeper development team, which he was overseeing at the time, to his house. Molyneux is quoted as saying he felt that EA was scared he was going to take everybody and do something else. And it was at that time that during the final development of Dungeon Keeper, Peter Molyneux, Mark Webley, Tim Rance, and Steve Jackson met in a pub and decided, let's start a company called Lionhead. Also, nerd out moment, I didn't realize the co-founder of Games Workshop, aka Warhammer, also started one of my favorite studios ever. Like, what the f? Molyneux's last act at Bullfrog was to see out development of Dungeon Keeper until its end. His last day would be the final test of the game before shipping, around July 1997. Without Molyneux at the helm, Bullfrog would still make successful games, but morale would slowly sink. Mark Healy, the lead artist for Dungeon Keeper, stated that following Molyneux's departure, EA sunk its teeth deeper into Bullfrog, and he equated to working there like being in a chicken factory or being assimilated by the Borg. Man, that's one hell of a foresight. Just a reminder, if you're enjoying this video so far, please click the like button and subscribe so you don't miss out on more content like this. Right, back to the video. With his new studio and ironclad team, Molyneux set out to create a company that would develop quality games without growing too large. Bear that in mind. At the same time, Molyneux wanted to create a more professional environment compared to his startup days at Bullfrog, and Lionhead would only develop one game at a time. Lionhead from the get-go had meetings with Sega, Nintendo, Eidos, and many more, but even then Lionhead had already settled on their first game. The studio signed one more game contract with EA, and the entire studio started initially working from Molyneux's house, but then relocated to the University of Surrey Research Park the next year. Which is hilarious because that's where Bullfrog's office is located, so the two were literally a stone's throw away. Lionhead made their first public appearance at the European Computer Trade Show in September 1997. This is the only footage of the event I could find, and I'm very grateful to the channel here for posting it. It's such a nostalgia trip. I'll leave a link in the description, you should check it out. Development of the studio's first game, Black and White, began in February 1998. Molyneux said he wanted to correct some of the mistakes he had with Dungeon Keeper to create a world where the player could feel like they can do anything. He'd also obviously pulled inspiration from his first God game project, Populous, with his interesting good and evil mechanics influencing the game's atmosphere, among other inspirations such as King Kong, and an episode of The Outer Limits called the Sand Kings, in which bug-like creatures begin worshipping a scientist who created them. This all started with a 6-man team, slowly growing once they had moved offices up to around 25 and a budget of £4 million. The entire game, from its tools to the libraries, were made from scratch. And even with all that needing to be made, Molyneux estimated the game would be finished in 1999, with a scheduled release date of September 2000. He told the programmers to make it the most beautiful game engine conceived by anybody. And I mean, I think they could have done with some more work on that part, but sure. Even by December 1998, no animators had been hired, the art team was still developing their skills in the new 3D environment, and the engine was being developed by just 3 people. Alex Evans, one of these developers, called it a daunting task. And yeah, I don't envy his position. The whole game was essentially made through trial and error, learning by trying, failing, changing the whole time. But even so, the team pushed for really creative ideas at the time that would push them to the limits. They wanted to avoid using control panels, icons, and buttons for the player's godlike actions, like miracles. So they developed the gesture system, the world changing based on the player's good or evil alignment. Even the cursor is not just a standard cursor, but a 3D hand. And as a side note, you may be wondering where some of this gameplay footage came from. Well, if you become a member today or access my Patreon, you can access my very first video, which is all about black and white. For just £2 a month, you can access all members only videos, but if you really want to support the channel, the producer tier gives you access alongside your name in the credits, exclusive updates and posts, which help guide the channel towards what you want to see me talk about. Anyway, enough shilling, back to the video. Now, originally the game was meant to be between battling wizards who had titans, what became creatures, and they were powered by belief. The game was also intended for the player to experience the same perspective of gameplay as if you had possessed a creature in Dungeon Keeper, so from a lower human scale view. You could also have the opportunity to take control of your creature in a first-person experience, which they totally should have kept in. I wish they kept that in. That would have been so cool, especially in black and white too. This was until Molyneux realized that the ability to zoom out and see the world from top down made much more sense, as well as the fact that the abilities granted to the player made more sense to be a godlike experience rather than just a human wizard. So spells became miracles, wizards became worshippers, and the towers were repurposed into the grand temples in the game. Work on the morality system fell to Richard Evans and project manager Mark Webley, who had just worked on programming the creature's AI routines. And Webley said that the morality system was 100 times more difficult than anything he'd worked on at Bullfrog. This entire team was putting together something that really hadn't been attempted before, and it was still an emerging genre. So the amount of work going into this new project was astronomically higher than anything the team had worked on before, and that became relevant at E3 2000. During the event, Molyneux gave a release date, the 23rd of September 2000, with the game expected to reach alpha stages in June. But by early summer, it became evidently clear the team needed much more time and development was behind schedule. And then in September, it was pushed back again to 2001. Even with the disappointment from the delays, Black and White had amassed a huge following before its release. There were numerous fan websites set up to talk about the game and share any information they could find. And even though these sites generated more and more hype around the game, Molyneux essentially blamed these sites for describing and imagining non-existent features of the game that led Lionhead to be accused of over-promising. By December 2000, the alpha stage was finally reached, and at this stage, EA became much more involved in development. QA testers were hired to find bugs, localizations were checked, and marketing had begun. And it was at this stage the biggest problem became apparent. The game was riddled with bugs. The QA team had found over 3,000 bugs, and they knew this could kill any momentum the game had gained. So, round the clock, developers were fixing bugs, and in some cases, fixing the bugs that created by the fixes. Molyneux equated this stage to having the entire team run a marathon just to get things working. And after this marathon, the release date was once again set for the 23rd of February 2001. That was until EA had to request one other change because, and I quote, "the age of which the villagers were reproducing was below the age of consent for some countries." After changing this, Lionhead announced the game had gone gold on 16th of March 2001, with Molyneux releasing an open letter thanking the fans for making the hardest times worthwhile. Black and White would finally release 27th of March 2001. Upon its release, Black and White was met with worldwide acclaim. It was truly an ambitious game, granting the player unprecedented freedom, stunning graphics for the time, and a wide appeal for anyone to indulge in how they would act as a godlike being. There were still those who didn't think the game was all that. Some said it was overrated, overhyped, and lacked features. But overall, the game sold incredibly well, and it was a step forward for Molyneux's new studio, paving the way for more games down the line. Following the game's release, the resulting cash flow was a huge boon for Lionhead. And in June 2002, I think at this stage, a lot of Molyneux's initial promises and objectives for Lionhead kind of just flew out the window. Lionhead had established or acquired satellite companies such as Big Blue Box Studios, Intrepid Computer Entertainment, and Black and White Studios. And with this came an expansion to the teams, with over 100 employees now present across Lionhead and its satellite sites, which meant they could develop more than one game. So instead of Molyneux promising to work on one game at a time, to really give it the focus it deserved, these new sites were working on 6 new games. That initial promise really flew out the window. Holy shit. The most important ones to focus on are Fable, the movies, and Black and White 2. Let's start with Fable. Fable began its development at Big Blue Box Studios, a developer set up in 1999 by Dean and Simon Carter along with Ian Lovett, all originally coming from Bullfrog, who seemed to be shedding employees following Molyneux's departure, all setting up their own individual studios. The first project at Big Blue Box would eventually become Fable. However, the game was ambitious, which led to it stagnating until Lionhead eventually picked the company up, starting out development as a variety of names such as Wish World, Project Ego, but finally settling on the name Fable. The very basic idea was to create a role-playing game like no other. Originally, Wish World wasn't solely focused on being an RPG, but rather a magical combat game where you could change the world around you. It was more of an action strategy game in the early stages, but slowly elements of the Fable we know and love would find its way into the game. Originally, it was meant to be set within a wizard's university known as the Academy, where its students were heroic individuals. And interestingly, the game was originally developed for the Sega Dreamcast due to a deal between the studio, Sega, and Microsoft. But because the Dreamcast was sadly a commercial failure, it was brought to the Xbox and was set to be one of the first exclusive titles for the console. I still miss the Dreamcast. At this stage, Big Blue Box was taken under the wings of Lionhead, and a team of 70 developers were working on the game, and it would take around 4 years for the team to get it ready for release. Over the course of the development, slowly shaping its way into the Fable we know it today, and Molyneux became heavily involved in its development and promotion. In an Xbox preview interview, he simply said, "It's going to be the best game ever." Way to keep expectations grounded. As Fable's release date approached, Big Blue Box would be integrated into Lionhead Studios fully to accelerate development. And of course, with this fast-paced nature, Molyneux began to say things just not true about the game. Here are some of the things he said that I found that ended up not being in the game. You can plant an acorn and grow a tree. You can carve your initials into a tree and see them 10 years later. Fable will be completely open with no invisible boundaries. You can poison a town's water supply, burn someone's house down with them inside it. Gangs of villagers will hunt you down once you become famous. You can watch your player slowly age from child to adult, and there's more where that came from. Now, obviously, none of this really ended up coming to Fable. Some of these features would be present in Fable 2, but ultimately this is the slippery slope that Molyneux began to go down of promising just about anything and talking about non-existent features. And this wouldn't be the last time. Either way, Fable was finally released September 14th, 2004. Despite not living up to every grand promise, it was well received. Praised for its charm, world building, and moral choice system, even if some of the bigger claims never came to fruition. It won over 50 awards, and it was one of Xbox's fastest selling games. Reviews tended to enjoy the combat most of all, but there were several flaws that were discussed. The biggest complaint obviously being the omission of the many promises that Molyneux had made across interviews and previews before the game's release, which required him to post on the Fable forums an explanation and apology, saying any feature he had discussed was in the game originally, but was cut due to time or it just didn't make sense. He also promised he wouldn't mention features to the outside world until they were implemented, tested, and actually real. Now, all the while Fable was being developed, the other 2 games I mentioned were also being worked on at the same time. And as soon as Fable shipped, Molyneux had to move over to help the Black and White team complete what they had. Unfortunately, I don't have a huge amount of details on the development of Black and White 2, but you would think that, given it's the successor to the company's flagship title, it would be relatively under control and steady. Well, let me read you a quote from Adam Langridge, a programmer on the Black and White team. Black and White 2 was a total mess. We had a dev manager who came in from British Rail, and he lasted 3 weeks. The guy absolutely shat himself when he joined. The pace of change was just so much compared to what he was used to. It can be very seat of your pants, and certainly at that time it really was. Everyone was making it up as they were going along. Sounds like Molyneux's ethos settled in quite well with the team. So Black and White's development was slowly going down the pan. How about the movies? Well, The Movies was a title that almost didn't get any involvement from Molyneux at all, and the team felt it was better as he was distracted by the other 2 games. They had a 60-man team working on the game, and to quote another developer from that team, Stuart White, here's how their development went. We had a 60-man team on the movies, and there were people on that team who were running out of work. They didn't know what they were meant to be doing next. It was literally just being made up as we went along. I likened it to that time in Wallace and Gromit where they were on the train and laying down train tracks ahead of the train. That was production desperately trying to give the team work to do. A team sitting around doing nothing isn't exactly a good thing for getting a game out. It was a crazy place. So with these 2 games essentially having a nightmare, how did they eventually release? Well, Black and White 2 was the first to release in October 2005, and it was met with what I would say is average reviews from various sites and magazines, and overall it didn't meet the sales expectations set by the publisher, EA. And the movies would release in November the same year, and once again it didn't meet sales expectations set by Activision. Molyneux specifically described the movies as a disaster due to a lack of playtesting. With these middling sales, Molyneux came out and said, "We should have done 1 game at a time rather than several games." No shit. So at this stage, Lionhead is in trouble. It was shelling out over $1 million a month just on the wage bill. So following these games releases, Lionhead made about 90 people redundant to entice potential buyers. 2 companies were interested in securing Lionhead around this time, Ubisoft and Microsoft. But even though negotiations were going incredibly well for Ubisoft at the time, Microsoft desperately wanted to secure Fable and prevent Ubisoft from putting it on the upcoming PlayStation 3. So in April 2006, Lionhead was acquired by Microsoft, and Lionhead for the time was secure. And the general feeling at Lionhead was that the purchase was the right move. It allowed them to expand their office, and Ted Timmins, the Fable franchise director, said this about the whole experience. Suddenly I was like, holy shit, we're a real developer. We're somebody, we're successful, and we're reaping the rewards. We suddenly had access to Microsoft tools, and every PC had a legitimate copy of Windows for once. It's good to see that office life doesn't change no matter where it is. Just so many unlicensed copies of Windows. Following the purchase, Microsoft had a mostly hands-off approach when handling Lionhead, allowing them to continue working on new ideas and concepts for the 2 sequels of Fable. Molyneux really wanted to push ahead on the more progressive elements of Fable 1, mostly because of the things he had promised that never came to fruition. One negative element from the new development, however, was that Lionhead began receiving death threats because the sequel included a gay character and 2 of the leading heroes were black. So John McCormack, one of the lead developers, saw all this blowback, and what did he do? He said, "Fuck you, we're doubling down on it now," which I absolutely love. Another sad element was one of Molyneux's directions. Fable 2 must have a dog, and that dog must die. While this may seemingly come out of the blue, Molyneux had a habit of implementing things that happened in his life into his games. He had 2 Labradors, which were shot by a farmer. One lived, one died. So he put his grief into almost using the game's dog as a reminder, or a memorial almost. He even said that it would be memorable in-game. You can kill 10,000 people and nobody bats an eye. But you kick one dog, they'll remember that. Kind of messed up when you think about it, but it's true. Now, because Lionhead was solely working on Fable 2 at this time, you would imagine that development would be a lot smoother compared to their previous games, right? Well, 6 months before its release, the game was still hugely unfinished, and was only completed under a huge amount of crunch. The game's story was almost non-existent, performance was struggling, and the game editor was a bloated mess taking huge amounts of time to make simple changes. One of the biggest problems developers had wasn't the crunch or the slow pace of change, but it was with the marketing from Microsoft. Microsoft was dead set on marketing Fable as an RPG with dragons and other D&D elements, because that's how they saw it. Lionhead wanted it marketed more of a Monty Python style comedy, but Microsoft was simply like, we know how to market games. Even with all this going on, Fable 2 launched as one of the most popular games on the Xbox 360. It even won a BAFTA. But that's not to say there weren't complaints such as bugs and other issues, but to me and a lot of people who played it, it was simply an amazing game. So Lionhead had 4 years to create Fable 2. And of course, Microsoft greenlit the sequel. So, how long would they be given to make it? 18 months. Now, it was expected that because the tools and experience was now in place, it should be quicker to turn around a sequel, which in theory, of course, works, I guess. Molyneux set out to make Fable more accessible to players. He didn't want the game to become too generic, where the player starts weak, builds up power, kills the main bad guy, and then credits roll. Molyneux wanted the player to kill the bad guy and then add on to the story from there. He took the concept of being good and evil and applied it to a ruler scale with usurping power and applying your beliefs onto a whole kingdom. But even with this new outlook, sacrifices had to be made and elements of what made Fable 2 such a great RPG were removed. And alongside that, there were countless bugs caused by the rush development. The Road to Raw feature didn't exist until a few months before the game was set to release. Prior to that, there was no leveling up. And even with all this going on, Molyneux was still trying to cram more features into the game, like a failed Kinect integration to include minigames where the player would use the Kinect to complete them. Thank God that was never included. They never really got everything perfect for Fable 3's release, and it was launched in a buggy, strange state. More problems with the game's marketing had also arisen with John McCormack. This time he wanted to feature a black woman on the cover art, but Microsoft flat out refused, as they said it would deter sales and make the game immensely unpopular. By 2012, things began to look bleak, once again, for Lionhead, and they experienced what they call Black Monday. Many Lionhead veterans were dissatisfied with the way the company was heading, and they all resigned on the same day. And initially, Molyneux was outraged, but even then, soon after this, in March 2012, he also left Lionhead to found yet another company, 22 Cans. This served as the death knell for Lionhead, and Microsoft cancelled the upcoming Fable Legends and then closed the studio entirely. To me, Lionhead was an incredibly special studio. I didn't grow up with many games, but one of the few I had was Black and White. And I remember watching my mum play it, and later playing it myself for hours on end. One of my clearest memories is my parents returning from the shops one day, and they handed me a boxed copy of Black and White 2. I was ecstatic. I played it relentlessly, and then was absolutely distraught when my disk drive eventually chewed up the disk. And even today, I still come back to the original Black and White. It was something truly different. There's nothing quite like it. Sure, there have been other games in the God game or management genre, but none have captured the same magic, the same essence. Black and White 2 especially stood out for me. Not just for the god powers or anything like that, but just for the sheer joy of building cities. I often spend so long developing my settlements that I'd win the level purely by impressing the enemy into joining me. Well, except for that last mission. That last mission can go fuck itself. And then there's Fable. Again, nothing has ever quite matched the feeling I got playing those games. The freedom, the exploration, the customization. I loved everything about it. Even Fable 3, which didn't quite reach the heights of Fable 2, it still had me hooked for countless hours on my 360. Learning the behind the scenes story of how these games were made has been a real insight into a big part of my life. Lionhead created the games that defined my sense of wonder in gaming. I always said that if I was to ever become a developer, I would have loved to have worked with them. They captured so much of what I love about games. Freedom, creativity, personal storytelling. Those are the things that I look for today. And truthfully, I'm still waiting to find anything that comes close to what Lionhead gave me. After leaving Lionhead to create 22 Cans with partners such as Tim Rance and Peter Murphy, Molyneux began working on their first game, the infamous Curiosity, What's Inside the Cube. Curiosity was a multiplayer social experiment, a giant cube in a featureless void made up of even smaller cubes. It was available on mobile platforms, and players would tap on these cubes to slowly chip away layer by layer with the goal of reaching the center. Each destroyed cube gave you coins which you could use to purchase abilities to speed up the mining of sections. Molyneux was constantly alluding that there is something they haven't told players about the cube, and that there was more to the game than just mindlessly picking away at tiny cubes in an endless void. Molyneux claimed that inside the cube was something life-changing, something amazing. And as his previous record has shown, a lot of people didn't really believe him, as he had built up quite a habit of overselling and under-delivering. The game was released on app stores on November 6th, 2012, and was going to be followed up with releases on PC and tablets, but following the unexpected surge in popularity, with over 3 million players tapping away at the cubes, those releases would be scrapped in favour of maintaining server stability. There really wasn't much to this release for a while, just players tapping away, chipping layer by layer of the cube. Originally, the team said that there was around 69 billion cubes to chip away at on the entire cube. And this would remain the case until the 26th of May, 2013. Peter Molyneux announced that the final cube had been mined and the contents of the cube had been opened. The winner was Brian Henderson in Edinburgh, and he was given the option to either keep the knowledge of what was inside a secret or reveal it. He chose to reveal it. And what was inside this mystical cube that millions of people had been chipping away from for over half a year? It turns out the entire thing was essentially an ARG for 22 Cans' upcoming game, Godus. Brian had won the role of God of Gods within the game, where he could control all other players and decide on the rules that the game was played by. He would also receive 1% of all revenue earned by Godus. Molyneux would announce that this would be for 6 months after the game's release. So what is Godus? Well, while the cube was being mined away, development began on Godus, a spiritual successor to games like Populous, Dungeon Keeper, and Black and White. A god game that Molyneux had always done so well. 22 Cans would launch a Kickstarter campaign to help crowdfund the game's costs, and it would reach its goal of £450,000 on December 20th, 2012. Stretch goals included more single-player modes, co-op, Linux and Ouya support. Remember the Ouya? Yeah, nobody else does either. The following year, Godus was released in early access on Steam on September 13th. The game would feel like a reinvented Populous in a way. The player would help guide a group of people to safety and help them expand by redesigning and reshaping the landscape. Growing the population grew your belief, which in turn allowed you to shape more land and expand and so on. You'll access different godly powers depending on your belief level, which again shape how much of your tribe you can expand. Problems started appearing once the game arrived in early access. Players complained about simplified graphics due to the game having to run on mobile platforms, the lack of features, the inclusion of microtransactions with gem currency, and all in all, a lack of development scene. By February 2015, 22 Cans switched their main focus to a new mobile game, The Trail, and the remaining Godus development team acknowledged that they simply can't see themselves delivering all the features promised on Kickstarter. So obviously fans were outraged and accused Molyneux of lying once again. In February 2016, they released Godus Wars, a more combat-orientated strategy game based on Godus, and this was given to existing Godus owners. 22 Cans announced that they would add multiplayer to Godus Wars, but this never happened. Fans were also outraged that they still included microtransactions in Godus Wars, but eventually these were removed. Then, by June 2016, the contract for the lead developer Konrad Nizinski had expired, and at that stage almost no one was working on the PC version of the game. Even as recent as December 2021, Molyneux stated that new features for Godus will be coming out before Christmas. This never happened, and the last official update to Godus was in April 2015. As of now, the game has been removed from Steam, and you can't even launch the game anymore. And with all this going on with Godus, what about Brian Henderson, who won the prize from the Cube? Well, 18 months after he had won the prize, Henderson reported that he heard nothing from 22 Cans. Apparently, according to Molyneux, the person in charge of staying in contact with Brian left the company, and nobody replaced them, which he said was inexcusable. The role of God of Gods was never implemented into Godus, and then in 2017, Molyneux said that Godus had not been profitable, and so Brian would not receive any money. He even said that he'd love to give Brian money, but he'd think he'd be insane to do so, as it would be seen as a publicity stunt. I mean, if you ask me, I think he should just give him something for at least mining all those cubes for nothing. Since Godus, 22 Cans really hasn't made anything of note. In February 2019, they announced Legacy, a game inspired by Molyneux's lost first game, The Entrepreneur. Legacy would incorporate blockchain-based elements, including NFTs, so that players could sell and purchase virtual items as part of the simulation. It would be released on the crypto platform Gala Games on October 26, 2023. And it's estimated that the game made 22 Cans over $50 million before the game even came out by selling land plots. And now Molyneux has announced that they would be working on a new game, Masters of Albion, a game that wants to combine elements of his two best games, Black and White and Fable, into an open world god game with third-person combat elements. Only time will tell if this game comes out well, but all I'm going to say is that in a blog where he only posted twice in 2023, Molyneux has been really interested in AI tools, especially generative AI, so take that as you will. Peter Molyneux has been a controversial figure throughout the years he's been involved in the games industry. He started by fumbling his way into the industry with Bullfrog, creating some truly amazing games at the time, some of which helped define entire genres. And Peter always seemed to mean well, at least in the beginning. He favoured player freedom and choice, the ability to shape, construct and bend the game to the player's will, rather than giving them strict, hard and fast rules. Games like Black and White, Fable, Populous and Dungeon Keeper inspired countless others, either through direct spiritual successors or by pushing the ideas of player agency further. I do think that Molyneux peaked during his time at Lionhead. Sure, this is where a lot of the lying and over-promising began, especially with Fable, but even then he still made good games in spite of that. Fable, even without many of the features he promised, is still a phenomenal title. And Black and White, as I said earlier, it's a game that I've never been able to find a true replicant for. It was simply unique, and maybe I'm looking at it through rose-tinted glasses of nostalgia, but it really did do some genre-defining things. After Lionhead and his move to 22 Cans, I don't know what happened. It's like something in him switched. The ambition and sincerity of a designer trying to create groundbreaking work seemed to fade. Curiosity was essentially an overglorified marketing campaign for a game that barely existed, and Godus, which could have been a true spiritual successor to Populous, turned into a broken promise. The whole project felt like a rug pull for the many supporters who believed in him because of his earlier work. Instead of making it right, he jumped to the next project, and now he's playing around with blockchain gimmicks and NFTs. It's hard not to see that as a complete departure of what he once was. It genuinely feels like that the drive and passion Molyneux once had evaporated after the fall of Lionhead. That infamous Black Monday, when so many developers were let go, may have deflated something in him, and now what's left is a hollow echo of the innovator he used to be. I do sincerely hope that the Masters of Albion is a return to form. It could be a redemption arc, a rekindling of the old flame, a project that makes amends with long-abandoned fans. But after the years of broken promises, the overhype and borderline scammy behaviour, I'm not willing to give him that hope. Not yet. And the saddest part is that Peter Molyneux didn't just change and damage his own legacy. He helped shape a wider trend in the industry. What used to be seen as one man's quirk Molyneux's habit of promising the world before the first prototype existed, has become a disturbingly common practice in the modern games industry. Overpromising has no longer become the exception, it's a marketing strategy. Publishers tease ambitious features in cinematic trailers. Crowd-funded games make lofty claims to secure backers. Studios push bold, innovative ideas, only to scale them down silently before launch. It's No Man's Sky, it's Cyberpunk 2077, it's Star Citizen. These aren't niche indie projects, these are some of the biggest, most anticipated games in recent history. And while some of these titles do eventually recover, like in the case of No Man's Sky, the damage is often already done. Players lose trust, developers burn out trying to meet impossible expectations, and the industry gets stuck in this loop where hype is more valuable than what's being delivered. Peter may have been one of the first to fall into this trap, but the industry has since made it a standard practice. In a way, his story acts as a warning, not just about the dangers of unchecked ambition or ego, but about how easily that behavior can become normalized when there's profit to be made. So maybe that's what makes Peter Molyneux such a tragic figure. He wanted to give players magic, and for a while he did. But in chasing the illusion of innovation, of the idea of a perfect game, he ended up helping create a culture that values the promise of greatness more than the reality of it. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this content and want to see more, click the like button and hit subscribe so you don't miss out on future content like this. Also, if you really want to support the channel, check out my channel memberships and my Patreon in order to gain access to certain exclusive videos and member posts, as well as help out the channel. Thanks again for watching. Bye for now.